Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Marcus Fielding, for those I haven't met, and I'm happily the President of Military History and Heritage Victoria. A couple of words about the organisation, just for those that aren't familiar with it just yet. We've only been running, as Andrew said, a couple of years, but we'd like to think that we're making some good inroads into our aims and objectives, and rather than go through the sort of the official version, the unofficial version is that we simply wanted to connect the community of people that are interested in military history and heritage, or who are passionate about it. And we've done that through a whole bunch of different activities, conferences, as Andrew mentioned, exhibitions. We publish articles on our website. We put up all the events and activities of our member organisations. And 2 years into the program, I think we're making some good headway. And I just reflect every now and again on the number of members that we have, and the number of events and activities that are going on. I mean, even today we've got an exhibition in Melbourne. We've got this weekend's activities, and we're already leaning forward for another Air Force-related conference in November. So lots going on. And I'd like to take this opportunity to publicly recognise the two patrons, or the one patron and the one vice patron that in the form of Jim Wood, which if you could just stand up, Jim, and Jim Barry's already done that, who have provided me with some great counsel over the last 2 years, and also a whole range of council members who are throughout the audience, and I'm sure you'll come across them in the course of the day. And we're largely a volunteer organisation, and we are a volunteer organisation, and so the number of activities and events that have been pulled together and generated by these individuals is tremendous, and so I'd like to thank them publicly this morning. I'll just reiterate Jim's words with thanks to the NWVM in terms of partnering with us for this weekend of activities. This was just an idea about 8 months ago, but it's tremendous when you actually get to the date. And you see the room full of faces, and we're going to obviously enjoy the 3 phases of the operation, as Jim called them, over the next 48 hours. So that's tremendous. And I really enjoy just seeing people meeting each other and connecting and establishing those links and common interests. So please make the most of that opportunity over the next 48 hours and get those channels open. It will raise, as Peter suggested, the profile of military history and heritage, and I think it's going to be an exciting time over the next 5 odd years for a whole range of reasons, not just Gallipoli. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce the keynote speaker, Air Vice Marshal Bob Treloar, and I'll just go through his biography so that we're all quite clear of where he's coming from. He joined the Royal Australian Air Force as an aircrew cadet in 1966. In 1969 and 1970, he flew helicopters with No. 9 Squadron during the Vietnam War, where he was mentioned in dispatches for distinguished service. He later became a fighter pilot and flying instructor and commanded the RAAF's first operational FA-18 Hornet Squadron, as well as No. 41 Air Defence Radar Wing at Williamtown. He commanded the multinational Integrated Air Defence System in Malaysia between 1997 and 1999. In 1999-2001, he was the commander of Australian Theatre, responsible for planning and the conduct of joint Defence Force operations throughout Australia and overseas. And in this appointment, he coordinated major aspects of Australia's East Timor deployments in 1999 and operational and logistic support to the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games. Air Vice Marshal Treloar was appointed as an officer in the Order of Australia in 2000 for distinguished service to the RAAF in the field of personnel management policy and as the commander of the Integrated Air Defence System. Following retirement from full-time Air Force service in November of 2001, he transferred to the RAAF Reserve, which I believe he's still a member of, and served as a member of the ADF Airworthiness Board. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite Bob Treloar to the podium now for the Q&A address.
Thank you for those kind words. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's an honour and a privilege to be here to provide the keynote address to this conference about helicopters and the war in Vietnam. I congratulate the members of the Military History and Heritage Victoria and the National Vietnam Veterans Museum for their conduct of this conference on a subject that is often overlooked or misunderstood when considering Australia's participation in the Vietnam War. When invited to deliver this address, I thought that I merely need to call upon my experiences and memoirs of my time in 9 Squadron. However, when I looked at the list of speakers for the conference and their topics, I actually understood then that I needed to have a slightly wider approach to this particular address. I've also been asked to talk about a couple of memories I have of Vietnam and some of my experiences, and I'll endeavour to do that for you. While we tend to think of choppers, chopper warfare being a product of the Vietnam War, this is not the case. The Americans in Korea and the French in Algeria were using helicopters in combat well before then. During my research, I came across this comment which I'd like to use today to anchor my address. Next slide, please. Air mobility was born during the Korean War, received its baptism of fire in Algeria, and came of age in Vietnam. Ladies and gentlemen, for air mobility helicopter operations. I'll briefly address the impact these conflicts had on the development of helicopters in combat and thus the conduct of chopper warfare in Vietnam. Helicopters had little impact on the progress or the outcome of World War II. There was some development of helicopter operations following World War II. The helicopter remained firmly in its infancy, both in capacity of carrying, development and power plants. With the declaration of the Korean War in 1950, the US Armed Forces deployed helicopters to conflicts, but they too had limited capability. However, these capabilities were slowly improved as the war progressed and new roles and techniques were developed, particularly for casualty evacuation. With the development of the helicopter, a new weapon was gradually forged for the first time since the tank made its dramatic appearance on the battlefield some 35 years previously. A month after the start of the Korean War, all 4 services were using helicopters to support their combat forces. 4 helicopters were used by the United States Marine Corps to carry troops, to resupply and later assist in the breakout of the Kusan Peninsula foothold held by the Allies after the surprise onslaught by the North Koreans. Helicopters were used in such varied roles as casualty evacuation, reconnaissance and battlefield surveillance, directional artillery fire, resupply, the laying of telephone cables, the carriage of commanders and staff officers, and the rescue of Allied pilots down in Mid-Yelling. The Marines also used helicopters to airlift troops to the tops of hills to capture the high ground much more quickly than by conventional means. The first ever tactical helicopter resupply was conducted on the 12th of September 1951 during Operation Windmill, when ammunition was carried by to the Marines on the battlefield and the dead and the wounded carried out. Nevertheless, the helicopter's involvement in the Korean War is best remembered for casualty evacuation, due, I think, in no small part to the television series MASH. The H-13, better known as the Bell 47, or Sioux, transported some 18,000 casualties during the war from a total casualty transport list of 23,000. The positive effect this had on troop morale was immediate and invaluable in raising the fighting effectiveness of the forces. While the United Nations was fighting in Korea, the French were fighting a war in Indochina and losing it. No helicopters were involved in combat operations, their primary role being limited to casualty evacuation. The subsequent introduction of the S-55, pictured here, which could carry 6 wounded and a medical attendant, bolstered the French casualty evacuation capability. With casualty evacuation promising to be an effective combat support service, the French defeated Dien Bien Phu, Dutch attack thought. 4 rescue helicopters carrying Red Crosses were shot down by Vietnamese artillery when they tried to evacuate wounded from a besieged stronghold. And by any standard, the employment of helicopters by the French in Indochina lacked an understanding of the operational environment, underestimating the enemy's ability to wage war. But on the other hand, in Algeria, the French commanders were more attuned to the demands of the principles of war and applied them successfully. They applied a great deal of initiative, which is noteworthy as at the time there was little, if any, recognised tactical doctrine for the conduct of chopper warfare. The Algerian War occurred between 1954 and 62, when the Liberation National Army, comprising some 30,000 to 40,000 Algerian Muslim guerrillas, challenged French colonial rule. While this conflict was predominantly an infantryman's war, the rugged terrain and tenacity of the enemy made mobility, good intelligence, and the provision of firepower essential. From a small helicopter force comprising 10 Bell 47Gs and 8 H-19s, at the start of the war, the French forces grew to some 380 helicopters to support approximately 425,000 troops in the field, a ratio of 1 helicopter to 1,100 troops. Helicopters provided support that would not otherwise have been available to the ground forces. Intelligence, command and control, application of firepower. The French developed the gunship. Their first gunship was a Bell 47 with a litter on the side with a soldier lying on the litter with a machine gun. Brave man. Transportation and, of course, logistic support. But of all the activities conducted by the helicopter forces, once again, casualty evacuation was considered the single greatest factor in maintaining the morale of the French forces. In essence, the French campaign in Algeria demonstrated that the helicopter had developed into a formidable weapon, essential to the successful outcome of guerrilla warfare fought by a force far from home. 45 years ago, the road system across South Vietnam was poor. Ground transportation of troops was slow, far too slow to be able to engage an enemy that had the ability to melt into the jungle or hide amongst the local population. The roads in existence often came under attack by the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army, which either precluded or increased the risk of their use. Moving on the ground, even with armoured artillery support, was often hazardous and time-consuming. Gotcha. This was an important consideration, and given that the role of the insurgent VC was to keep the initiative and attack selected targets within their capability to ensure their success. While the Allied forces' role, of course, was to attack the insurgents and keep them off balance. To do this, once again, helicopter operations were essential. But like the French build-up of helicopter forces in Algeria, the US build-up in South Vietnam was initially quite modest, and I would suggest that the lessons learned by the French in Algeria had not been absorbed by the Americans. Notably, the first American helicopters deployed to Vietnam were not armed. The first American helicopter units were deployed to South Vietnam in 1961 to support armed South Vietnamese forces. These aircraft were Shawnees or H-21 flying bananas, which you saw in the photograph of the French helicopters in Algeria. But there was never enough airlift available to meet the demand, and more helicopters continued to be deployed to South Vietnam. Realising this, brought a rapid build-up of helicopters to meet the varied roles required to combat insurgency. However, it was not until the turbine-powered Huey made its entrance onto the battlefield that helicopter support was truly transformed. Initially, only 5 Hueys were deployed in the medevac role to South Vietnam in 1962. These were based at Nha Trang and would support the entire armed forces. The forces, of course, were spread right across South Vietnam, but the presence of medevac choppers did much to boost the morale of the troops. and along with B-52, the Huey became the signature aircraft of the Vietnam War. The sound of rotor blades slapping the air and the appearance of a Huey quickly became a welcome sight to many hard-pressed troops on the ground. Of all the roles performed by a wide variety of helicopter types and sizes, their major impact on the way operations in the Vietnam War were conducted can be best identified in these roles: air mobility operations, gunship fire support, medical evacuation operations, and logistics support. The first American combat units arrived in South Vietnam in March 1965, ground combat units, and with them came an increase in the number of helicopter units. Until then, the war had been fought by South Vietnamese forces and American advisors. The Americans had realised the need for increased mobility of forces back in 1962 and developed the air mobile concept. It became a reality with the formation of the 1st Cavalry Division in 1965. The newly developed air mobility tactics called for battalion-sized forces to be delivered into, supplied and extracted from an area of action using helicopters. Since heavy weapons of normal combined arms forces could not follow, the infantry would be supported by coordinated air, artillery and airborne rocket fire. These tactics have been practiced in America. When the 1st Cavalry Division was deployed to Vietnam in 1965, it had 428 helicopters, or nearly 5 times the number found in a normal infantry division. It only had 1,600 ground vehicles, and most of these were of jeep size, or about half the number normally found, again, in an infantry division at that time. This was a remarkable turnaround by the US Army and its infantry commanders. By 1965, the VC forces and the NVA were in nominal control of the countryside and had set up a major military infrastructure in the Central Highlands, to the northeast of Saigon. It's ringed on the map. The Vietnamese communist forces had operated in this remote area and remote and distant area during the previous decade in their war against the French, winning a notable victory at Man Yang Pass in 1954. Ia Drang Valley was in the heartland of this area and had been attacks against US Special Forces challenging the US presence, notably around the Pleiku area. The battle was the first civilian contact between US and North Vietnamese forces. It provided an ideal opportunity for the Americans to engage the NVA and test their new concept for air mobility operations. Casualties for the battle were high on both sides, but the point of the example is that the battle could not have been waged without helicopter support. Indeed, it probably would have been lost had it not been for this support. The French had found that out 10 years earlier. Of note, 59 helicopters were hit. 4 were shot down, 3 of which were recovered. These results, actually, in the Battle of Ia Drang, helped convince doubters that the helicopter was nowhere near as vulnerable as first regarded, and in fact was here to stay. As an aside, some years later, in Phuc Tuy province, was scrambled to do a medevac mission, and it was to bring soldiers from 5 RAAF company out of the jungle up in the Hut Sik area. The US Army Dustcloth aircraft had been in before me and had been ordered off under fire and weren't co-pilot. When it was our turn to go, we went in and winched out 3 soldiers, and again under some fire. I managed to try and hide the aircraft behind some bamboo by chopping down the bamboo of the rotor blades, which you leave no end to the senior engineer officer of the squadron at the time. And the whole process managed to get the chopper fairly well holed. But the point of the example is that while it wasn't immune from ground fire, it did withstand some reasonable damage. If I can go back to the story, the French in Algeria had already learned that protection of lightly armed transport helicopters was essential. During early helicopter operations in South Vietnam in 62-63, the Vietcong were quick to grasp the vulnerability of a helicopter when it was landing and taking off. And they were able to fire on these choppers and hit them. And this caused the Americans to review their policy. while fast heavy aircraft were able to provide close air support, they were not readily suited for the support of helicopter operations. And the need for autonomous support quickly became evident to the ground commanders. Of interest, the US Army was not allowed by American law to employ slow-flying armed fixed-wing aircraft in an attacking role. This was a role reserved for the Air Force. But slicks were strictly armed after they learned their lessons, and the development of the gunship became inevitable. Gunships, again, were not initially allowed to fire on enemy positions unless they themselves were fired upon first. That policy was withdrawn in March 1963, and the effectiveness of the gunship was immediate. And also the slicks. You right there, mate?
It's timing by itself.
Oh, is it? Okay. I should speak faster. The hits on the slips, of course, around the landing zones also were reduced by some 35%, which is a remarkable amount. As in Korea and Algeria, medevac operations, or dust-off sorties as they were known in country, continued to provide a huge morale booster for troops on the ground, providing quick transportation to medical facilities to save lives and limbs. Not only did they have a humanitarian role, but the removal of wounded troops from the battlefield enabled commanders to continue to fight without the encumbrance of having to protect the wounded. This increased the effectiveness of the fighting force. Of all the operations undertaken by helicopters, I think medevac sorties were the most challenging, as they were normally no-notice sorties with little or no pre-planning. Intelligence on the tactical situation was quite often incomplete, and the situation demanded was time critical. On my first sortie in Vietnam, after a few days in country to familiarise myself with the place, was a sortie up into the province to look at the main features and get myself acquainted before launching into operations. We were flying past Dat Do, which is a large village just to the south of Nui Dang, and one of the crewmen saw breeding traits that come out of Dat Do, which I was told at the time was not good. Didn't need much I have to say. I was still trying to read a picto map and work out which way I was up, and it was somewhat of a mystery. In the meantime, the captain flipped to the South Vietnamese military radio frequency, talked to the US advisor on the ground who requested assistance. We then landed in a very spectacular fashion, as I recall, in what I took to be the village square. It was confused, and I recall the US advisor standing on the steps asking us to take out wounded and dead armed soldiers, which we duly did. While this conversation was occurring, BC fire was directed in our general direction, 50, 60 metres away. The advisor returned to the answered fire, and then we went on with the conversation. We left shortly after that with, I can't recall now, but half a dozen or so dead and wounded on the back of the chopper. There was a confusion of blood, bandages and bodies in the back. And after unloading the wounded at Back Beach, which were in trouble because we were supposed to take them to the Rock Hospital, we returned to Bunk Tower, cleaned out the aircraft, and I completed my familiarisation mission. And I thought, if this is day one, God help day 365. On the American side, there were only 10 US Army medevac Hueys in country in 1965, but by 1969, this number had grown to some 140. Of the US Army's 130,000 personnel wounded in action, some 100,000 were evacuated by helicopter. I hesitate to put this figure up because in my research there are many numbers within various research areas. Somewhere around 300,000 Americans were wounded. Most of them didn't require hospitalisation or evacuation, but were recorded as wounded. A figure that seems to come to mind is about 153,000 wounded that required evacuation, but that was across all forces. Well, French. You with me? Yes, you are. While the French did not have the resources to build and deploy a large helicopter force to Algeria to combat the rebels, the Americans didn't suffer the same problem. The French deployed 380 helicopters to provide a ratio of about 1 helicopter to 1,125 troops in the field. The US deployed forces and helicopter numbers to provide a ratio of 1 helicopter to 250 troops. Importantly, the helicopter force was integrated into the combat force. Between 1966 and 1971, the US flew over 36 million helicopter sorties. They lost just over 2,000 helicopters to hostile action and just over 2,200 to other operational causes. A total of some 5,000 helicopters lost from a force of just under 12,000. There are also some 2,200 US helicopter crew deaths during that operation. It is important to remember that most of the time the chopper war was conducted in a relatively permissive air environment. In 1971, against heavy anti-air defences during Operation Lamson 719 into southern Laos to endeavour to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail once again, the supporting forces suffered a loss of helicopter loss of 15%. 107 helicopters were shot down, with more than 600 damaged during the operation. So permissive air did make a difference. But whichever way you look at the operation of the US, it was a monumental effort. When I was developing this address, I became keenly aware that there was a focus on 9 Squadron. And while not intending to ignore the other two services, contribution to the chopper war, as they both served with great distinction and effectiveness. But it was 9 Squadron that provided the main support for the Australian Task Force. And I know that commentary on the other two services has been made by later speakers. So to put the picture into context, we've mentioned before, in this conference, of the conflict between Army and Air Force. The government committed forces to Vietnam. The Air Force had 2 helicopter squadrons, 5 and 9. 5 Squadron was a very small squadron. It only had 4 aircraft, and a very limited skeletal crew and minor maintenance capability. Everything else was provided by 9 Squadron. Moreover, the helicopter force was short of qualified and experienced helicopter pilots, a situation that was bedeviled the force for a long time. The helicopters had originally been purchased in 1962 for search and rescue, with battlefield support a secondary role. The support of the Army became the primary role of the squadron in 1963, reversing their roles. And during the 3 years before deployment to Vietnam, 9 Squadron and Army developed land-air warfare doctrine and tactics, which was agreed by both services. When the government dispatched 9 Squadron to South Vietnam, the Tui province was well and truly under the strong influence of the Viet Cong. Not to mention the intrusion of the NVA. For example, the Battle of Long Tan occurred 5 kilometres east of Nui Dat, only 2 months after the arrival of the squadron in the country. 9 Squadron achieved a high reputation and worked closely with Army. It carried out a number of different types of missions: troop lifting, inserting and extracting special air service patrols, evacuating wounded troops, spraying herbicides and pesticides, dropping leaflets, flying olfactory reconnaissance or people sniffer missions, and resupply, of course. The squadron supported every major operation conducted by the Australians. During 1966 and 67, 9 Squadron had only 8 aircraft, with 6 online, and only enough pilots to man the 8 aircraft, or less when medical issues or other duties were considered. And this was to support 2 battalions in the field. Air crew averaged 1 day off every 3 weeks, with 12 to 16-hour working days in between. In fact, a lack of pilots dogged the squadron for much of its early deployment to Vietnam. As a result, when the Australian government announced the deployment of a 3rd battalion to Vietnam, it doubled the size of the squadron's aircraft complement to 16, supplying them with hotels. In effect, this quadrupled the squadron's air capability, but the catch was there were still insufficient pilots to fly the aircraft. Supplementary manning was provided by the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and by December 1971, 16 Kiwi pilots had served with distinction in 9 Squadron. squadron manual was also supplemented by the Royal Australian Navy. In 1968, the three Navy pilots, along with the RAAF pilots, constituted nearly one-quarter of the squadron's aircrew complement. In all, 8 Navy pilots served with the squadron, and this was in addition to its commitment to provide aircrew and maintenance personnel requested by the US government. These Navy personnel were integrated into the 135th Assault Helicopter Company, the Blackhorse, just north of Victoria Province, and managed to see them on camera. 4 of the UH-1Hs were converted to gunships, armed with twin fixed forward firing 7.62mm miniguns and 2 2.75-inch rocket launchers, as well as the 2 twin door-mounted M60 machine guns. The bushrangers, as they were known, were able to cover troop-carrying helicopter operations during combat assaults, insertion and extraction of SAS patrols if the situation went hot, and provide fire support to troops in contact. The firepower and flexibility of a gunship flight was significant. In June of 1969, we were scrambled. I was a co-pilot on Bushranger 71, which was the lead aircraft of a heavy fire team, to participate with troops in contact at a little village called Binbar, about 12 kilometres or so, I think, from memory, north of Merdad. Initially, it was the troops in contact with 2 choppers and then a third to join us, but it rapidly developed into what is now known as the Battle of Binbar. The village was a Christian village. It was laid out in a very neat fashion, rows of houses with a church to the north of it, the village, and there were an NVA regiment, I forget the number of the regiment now, I think 33rd, both were expected to be in the village. The initial contact, the Army thought it was only a couple of platoons. As the firefight developed, it was obvious it was more enemy than initially had been thought, and we were requested as a heavy fire team to suppress fire coming out from the southern edge of the village while members of the fire barrier moved into place. This we did by destroying the row of houses with rocket fire. Of interest, and captain, because I was a co-pilot, took his two-alarm one of the passes and dislodged the house guy from one of the houses, which just swirled up in the middle of the air and seemed just to sit there forever. I felt the chopper twitch both ways. And then the house dog hit the piercing through the windscreen and embedded itself in the back of the chopper. Luckily, it only just hurt. Because if we'd been hit and shot down by a house dog, I can tell you it would have been damn embarrassing. I asked the captain later why the aircraft twitched, and he said, I was trying to work out which side of the windscreen to put the tile through, yours or mine. But also in the same event, one of the Centurion tanks travelled quite near to the houses, and we could see quite clearly North Vietnamese soldiers endeavouring to move towards the tank, so we laid down suppressive minigun fire into the area around the tank. Of course, some did hit the top of the tank. It sounded like heavy rain, but they were grateful for it. From the time the first Australian task force completed, for the first time the Australian task force had complete autonomous support with the introduction of the gunship, although medevac helicopters still continued to provide support from the Americans on call during the day. We did it during the night. An especially close relationship was forged between the SASR and the squadron. Insertion and recovery operations were a particular activity where an All-Australian force was clearly a significant advantage and enabled detailed planning procedures to be undertaken. In the early days, support from the US with gunships was not always available. Insertion of SAS patrols required a light fire team of 2 bushrangers, a mission leader in Albatross Sierra 1 flying about 1,500 feet, a couple of miles behind the formation, and depending upon the size of the patrol to be inserted, 1 or 2 slicks, Albatross Sierra 2 and Albatross Sierra 3, flying at treetop level for insertion into the LZ. An airborne spare would hold for some distance to assist with the evacuation of the aircrew or patrol should a helicopter be down during the activity. After the introduction of the bushrangers, gunship support was always available for these activities. The amount of time needed for planning and briefing was significant and demanded the attention and intellect of the crew, air crews, and the leaders of SAS patrols being inserted. I have never seen more heavily armed troops who, on occasions when entered the chopper, actually tested lifting capacity of the helicopter. Or bigger smiles on the same faces when we recovered at the end of the patrol. We learnt to recognise that when a whispered call from the patrol said that the pad was secure and it was clear to come in, was on occasions not always the case. Nevertheless, these operations forged very strong bonds of trust and mutual respect between 9 Squadron aircrew and the SAS squadrons which they supported. 9 squadrons inserted over 1,100 SAS patrols during its tour of duty. Of interest from a personal point of view, while NVA were prepared to take on helicopters across the country, because of the availability of heavy weapons, I would imagine, in Fukui province, in my exposure to operations, they seldom elected to engage helicopters unless it was critical for them to do so. Our 9th Squadron flew its last mission in Vietnam on the 19th of November 1971. In December, the squadron of 16 Iroquois took off from Vung Tau Airfield and landed on the decks of HMAS Sydney, a return trip to Australia. By then, the squadron had flown over 237,000 sorties, carried 414,000 passengers, conducted 4,000 CASEVACs and some medevacs, and transported almost 12,000 tonnes of freight. 7 aircraft were written off or destroyed, 37 damaged, 23 by gunfire, ground fire. 4 members of the squadron have been killed, and 2 others have been killed while attached to the squadron. 8 aircrew were wounded in action. Importantly, helicopter support made the difference. The challenges that face 9 Squadron should not be dismissed lightly. The squadron was tasked with troop transport, aerial resupply, ground attack, medical and casualty evacuation, observation and reconnaissance, insertion and extraction of SAS patrols, and other duties when required. No other squadron commander and a team of relatively junior officers could have faced such a complex range of missions and with a relatively new weapon in a very new battlefield environment with minimal support and training. There was an expectation of multiple and complex tasks. Okay. There was an expectation of multiple and complex tasks conducted within a single squadron, and the Americans would have designated, in my opinion, individual squadrons to conduct these tasks. Lessons, the chopper operations were learned and relearned during the 3 wars that I mentioned today. While Australia entered the Vietnam War quite late in the game, and like the experiences of our allies, notably the US, its helicopter force was in the main ill prepared and poorly equipped. But it had a significant advantage. It could learn from the early experience of our American allies, who were more than willing to lend a hand. The experience of Iron Valley was, to my mind, the epiphany for chopper warfare in Vietnam. The battle would have not been won. In fact, it's highly likely it would not have been fought at all, at least in the way it was, if it had not been for helicopter support. If I may quote a comment contained on the US Army Aviation Museum website. They were an imperfect and seemingly ungainly aircraft. The ubiquitous helicopter touched the everyday lives of young men who fought in the harsh climes and terrains of South Vietnam. The helicopter took them into battle, provided close air support, supplied and resupplied them, and evacuated the wounded and the dead. From an Australian perspective, the outcome of the Battle of Long Tan would not have been the same if it hadn't been for chopper support and the critical resupply of ammunition at a crucial time in the battle. And I would venture to say that given the high number of successful medevac sorties conducted by the squadron during the Australian deployment to Vietnam, it is not unrealistic to consider that without this support, there would have been more Australian flags at the heads of Anzac Day marches today. In an environment of poor infrastructure across the Fukui province, a province geographically suited to guerrilla warfare, helicopter support for land forces gave them increased mobility, the element of surprise, the provision of effective command and control over the battlefield, and importantly, the high morale factor with the availability of near-immediate medevac support. Choppers not only made the difference to operations, they transformed the way the war was fought. Thank you. and take me flying in his shoe on some of my days off. Until after some days later I found that he was sitting on the number plate seat and I wasn't. We had smaller backsides in those days. It's interesting because I wrote into my speech that the 9th Squadron was destined to go to Nui rather than it was only staging through Vung Tower. I sent a copy of the speech to Ray Scott, who was the first CEO of 9th Squadron. He was in fact the man who developed the helicopter, brought it back from America, set it up in Australia, and then subsequently became the first CEO. And I might add, the squadron had 6 weeks notice to deploy overseas. So much for the 15 years warning time of the white paper in those days. But he sent me an administrative directive, a copy of the original signed by a group captain on behalf of the Chief of Air Staff for the day. And the intention was always for the squadron to be deployed to Vung Tower, never to Nui. The reason being it was they had 35 squadron carriers there, they had a support unit there. Initially there would have been some difficulty, they said, back in '66 of supplying AFTER and other fuels to the field. That turned out later to be both going to be okay because we flew regularly with flying operations out of Nui. But the intention at that stage in the Air Force was to just have a congregation of massive air forces in the one spot.
We're doing an operational research of the parts of the combat operations, and I'll talk to you later about one of the third time squadron activities in it. But at the Battle on Tang, the official history talks about the problems of flying in that ammunition for the battle, where the Air Force were operating on their peacetime regulations in Australia, and there was an argument, and
yes.
it seems to have indicated that the pilots took the action and not the senior commander. Would you like to comment on it?
Yes, well in part, but I think Nick Moran might going to talk about that as well, so I might do a part of it. But let me say that my squadron was not operating under peacetime regulations. They took, squadrons have things called flying order books, and in that every pilot reads it, signs off on it once a month, every aircrew signs off on it once a month. All the peacetime restrictions were struck in the book before, as they got to Vietnam. For example, the official weight lifting capacity of an aircraft Bravo was some 6,600 pounds. That was above that, then Bell Helicopter Company wouldn't guarantee the warranty and everything else that goes with it. In Vietnam, the decision by the squadron CEO, and I assume it's the senior engineering officer at the time, up that to 7,600. And then it was up again to depend if the helicopter could hover with about 3% of spare capacity, then it could fly. Now that certainly isn't a peacetime restriction. Of interest, the fact of not using any lights at night, according to the CEO of the squadron of the day, 9th Squadron of the day, was that that was a one task force directive of the squadron. It wasn't a squadron directive at all. They would have used landing lights at night, but they were forbidden to do so. And that was one of the issues with landing at after the Battle of Long Tan, when it took how long for the Australian helicopter 9th Squadron to get in to pull the wounded out. There were lights on, and they were from American dust-off trucks. They went under the same restriction. So there's a whole bunch there with people like Ray Scott, which is a font of information that's still very lucid in his memory and gathering his facts. I think actually attacks a few of what I think are the myths of that kind of activity. But the same in order to take away from Nick, and he would then try to explain something so I won't go further.
I was force ATO in '67 attached to AOD. I suggested you might like to add 2 more roles to your list.
They're probably not.
To briefly mention about people sniffers.
Yes.
Once they were taken off ground usage because they were ineffective and put on helicopters, each particular section of the American divisions patrolled on any still morning just about the whole of Vietnam. I identifying targets for intelligence purposes was very effective.
Yes.
The other one was bombing. We used Chinooks and really just helicopters to drop large quantities of CS throughout Vietnam, to the extent that America ran out of CS in their production and reserves, had to go to other chemical products and try to upgrade their production techniques. So that was an extensive use throughout Vietnam.
Yes. She looks like would also use to drop large bladders of fuel and to detonate and be detonated just above the ground to endeavour to clear landing zone. So a myriad of activities helicopter undertaking. Next.
Well, just finish your point.
Yeah,
You said one comment about dust off. For most of us that were in there, dust off was in fact one of the great things that we could do for since leaving Vietnam, and I'm involved in other bits and pieces, I found that in fact the dust off actually had a negative side. One of the things during the Second World War and the First World War, quite often, when your buddy was shot, taken out, whatever you want to call it, he was there with you for a while. And you could grieve. What was happening in Vietnam, and they've now changed it slightly in Afghanistan, was that you were in a fight, your buddy got wounded or taken out, he was dusted off, raced back, and quite often his life was saved. But when the soldiers got back to doing that, his clothes had already been taken. A new guy was in the place, and they couldn't grieve. And I believe a lot of our Vietnam soldiers, for whom the war was much more personal than the chopper fighters, were not able to grieve. And that caused a lot of the problems we're having now with them. Yet, in Afghanistan now, one of the things I applaud, a guy gets taken out and they grieve. They have their service at Afghanistan. They say goodbye to you. So although dust-off is a really good thing, it can have a negative side. And hopefully now from the lessons we've learned from Vietnam and Afghanistan, dust-off will still continue to get them out of the battle, but it'll give the soldiers time to breathe.
Thanks, folks.